Okay, so today we finish our summer series on the book of Acts. We have worked through all 28 chapters of the book of Acts, so give yourself a pat on the back. You did a great job. And I want to lighten things up today compared with last week's subject matter, which was about a real live fascist cult in America. So we're going to pull back from that a little bit, pull back from the edge there. And we're going to start today with a little bit of geeky Bible trivia. Today we are in one of 3 sections in the book of Acts that is narrated in the first person plural. Now, where most of Acts is told in the third person, he did this, they went there, so-and-so said this. There are 3 short sections in the book, including the section we are in today, where the narrator starts saying, we did this and we went there. Now, we didn't hear that in the actual reading we did, because even when you're in the first person plural, you still talk about what other people are doing. They did this, but then we also did this. But you got to trust me, it's in there from 27:1 to 28:16. We're in the first person plural. And that's really exciting for biblical scholars. I mean, it doesn't take much to excite a biblical scholar, but that's exciting for biblical scholars. So there's a few possible explanations for this change in voice. One is that the author of Acts was actually present with Paul during these parts of the story, which would make these eyewitness accounts of the action. And that's pretty cool. That's a pretty neat idea that we're reading an eyewitness account of this sea voyage. A less neat possibility, and I think less compelling, is that the narrator just uses this as a literary device to make the story more interesting. And then there's one other possibility, that the author was actually using a travel diary of someone who was with Paul during those times. And so the author is just inserting directly the travel diary into the book of Acts. Regardless, it's a mystery because the author never comments on why they move to first person plural. It just happens for a little while, and then it goes back to third person. So just keep that in mind as we watch a couple videos now. These videos do a great job with great graphics and history of retelling the story of Paul's sea voyage to Rome. And together, there's 2 videos together of about 7 minutes long. So it's movie day for the sermon, all right? So it's movie day. And I'll make 1 point at the end of the videos.
According to Acts chapter 27, the voyage to Rome was arranged quickly, and Paul was handed over to a centurion named Julius. It's obvious from the text that Luke would go along too, as well as a man named Aristarchus from Thessalonica. The ship left Caesarea en route to Asia province. Along the way, they landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to visit Christian friends there. From Sidon, they put out to sea again and faced stiff winds. The ship had to detour to the leeward side, or sheltered side, of Cyprus before landing at the port of Myra. Today, Myra is home to a well-preserved archaeology site on the southwest coast of Turkey, which contains this Roman theater and these incredible rock-cut tombs. At Myra, Julius arranged for Paul and his party to board a new ship, an Alexandrian grain freighter bound for Italy. These grain freighters were large commercial vessels that were a common sight on the Mediterranean Sea during the time of Paul. These ships could carry a vast amount of cargo and hundreds of passengers, and were not exceeded in size until the beginning of the 19th century. The ship would have been part of a well-organized fleet that carried passengers and manufactured goods such as pottery and metalwork from Italy to Egypt. In Egypt, the goods would have been exchanged for new passengers and grain and would return to Italy. With favorable weather, the voyage from Italy to Egypt was an easy 2 weeks. But the return trip with grain-heavy ships was a different matter. Because of the prevailing weather, the ships had to travel against the wind and make a number of turning maneuvers or tacks back and forth across the Mediterranean Sea. This voyage was not for inexperienced captain or crew, and there were often long periods of waiting in ports for the weather and wind to cooperate. According to the 27th chapter of the book of Acts, the Alexandrian grain freighter finally left port at Myra and made sluggish progress towards Rome. Luke's account says that it was, quote, after the Day of Atonement. Therefore, it was likely the middle of October and very late in the year to make the passage safely. The storm season was fast approaching. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens. Much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous, so Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the captain of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete. Acts 27, 7 through 12. Fair Havens and the rugged southern coast of Crete provided no shelter for Paul's ship. It's not hard to imagine that the captain of the ship would have ignored the warnings of a prisoner. Therefore, the captain decided that they should not stay there for the winter and tried to move on to Phoenix, a port on the protected side of the island, about 40 miles away. As we're about to find out, that would prove to be a disastrous decision. According to Acts, the fearful crew lowered their sails and dropped a sea anchor into the water to slow their movement towards Syrtis. A sea anchor is like a big parachute in the water to stabilize the ship in the waves and currents. And then the sailors began to throw cargo and equipment overboard to lighten the load. Day after day, the wind and the waves pounded against the ship, weakening the timbers and soaking the passengers. Everyone on board was cold, sick, hungry, and afraid. Luke wrote, "When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved." Acts 27:20. For 2 weeks, they were adrift, being driven by the winds, expecting the end with every wave. But the vessel held together, and they were no longer being driven toward the Syrtis sands off Libya. Here's what happened next, according to Luke's dramatic first-person account. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found that it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. "For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head." After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. Acts 27:27 through 41. So according to the rest of Luke's account, the Roman soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners so that they couldn't escape in all the chaos. But Julius, wanting to spare Paul's life, said no. He ordered everyone to jump overboard and swim for it. So they did. All 276 people on board. And so, Paul's promise of everyone escaping and surviving came true. And they one by one washed ashore on the island of Malta.
And you will have to watch that on YouTube to find out how it ends, because that's the end of our section there. It really speaks, the video does a great job on how perilous, communicating how perilous this voyage was. And here is our point for today. In this wonderful sea voyage narrative, Paul is still a prisoner. He's a prisoner the whole time. He's in the boat, in chains, under guard, in the middle of a storm. And yet, in the midst of all that, he becomes a minister. He becomes a caregiver to all the passengers. He does not let the things that hold him back prevent him from caring for those around him. He does not let the things that hold him back prevent him from caring for those around him and following God's call. In particular, in our passage, he cares for them by offering them communion. He doesn't just feed them in the story, he offers them a sacred moment in the midst of chaos, an opportunity to breathe, to take a moment of rest and self-care by connecting to God through the ritual of communion. He says, I urge you to take the food, your health depends on it, you won't lose a single hair in your head. And he said these things, and he took the bread, gave thanks to God in front of them, and broke it and began to eat. Those three things are the ancient Christian communion liturgy: to take the bread, to give thanks, to break it. We are told when they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. Friends, in these stormy times, as we face a pandemic, social upheaval, and the threat of rising authoritarianism in our nation, we gather around the communion table, not as a retreat from the world, but to re-engage the world from a more grounded, more powerful posture. We make time for a sacred moment. We breathe, we give thanks, we break bread, and we are nourished in body and spirit by grounding ourselves in the powerful, self-giving love of Christ. In a difficult and even hostile world, communion was fundamental to the early church's effort to sustain itself and to thrive. So let it be for us today. Amen.